worked 16 hours a day to keep a roof over our children's heads while my husband stayed home playing the misunderstood genius. I ignored the red flags for years, believing his empty promises of a startup empire. But the night I came home exhausted to find an $80,000 truck in my driveway, I finally stopped being the blindly supportive wife. Instead of screaming, I made a single phone call that systematically dismantled his entire life. My name is Olivia and I am 34 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. And if you have ever had to break free from a partner who financially and emotionally used you, hit subscribe. Trust me, you will want to hear how I served him the ultimate reality check. It was 11:30 on a Tuesday night. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my 10-year-old sedan so hard my knuckles were white. I had just finished a brutal 16-hour double shift. By day, I was a regional finance manager for a medical supply company, managing corporate accounts. By night, I worked as a freelance bookkeeper, taking on private clients just to ensure we could afford the mortgage and keep the lights on. My husband, Derek, who was 36, had not worked a steady job in 3 years. He called himself a startup founder. I called him a man who spent his days scrolling social media and complaining that corporate America just did not understand his vision. As I turned onto our quiet suburban street, all I wanted was to kick off my heels, check on our twin toddlers, who were hopefully fast asleep, and collapse into bed. But as I pulled up to my house, my headlights illuminated a massive obstruction blocking the driveway. I slammed on the brakes, my heart jumping into my throat. Sitting right in the middle of my driveway was a brand new, aggressively shiny midnight black heavy-duty luxury truck. The dealership plates were still bolted to the back, and the gleaming chrome rims reflected the streetlights. This was not just a vehicle. It was an $80,000 status symbol. I stepped out of my car, the crisp night air biting through my thin blazer. Confusion washed over me, followed quickly by a rising tide of panic. Whose truck was this? Why was it parked at my house? That is when I heard the heavy bass of hip-hop music thumping from the backyard. I could smell the distinct aroma of expensive steaks sizzling on a charcoal grill. I walked around the side of the house, my sensible work heels sinking slightly into the grass. When I opened the wooden gate to the backyard, the scene before me made my blood run cold. The patio was lit up like a fraternity house on a Friday night. Empty beer cans littered the outdoor glass table I had spent hours cleaning the weekend before. Standing by the grill, holding a pair of tongs like a scepter, was Derek. He was wearing a brand new designer polo shirt that I definitely had not bought for him. Surrounding him were 3 of his buddies, all men in their late 30s who seemed to share Derek's allergy to stable employment. They were laughing loudly, clinking expensive craft beer bottles together. Derek turned and saw me standing frozen at the gate. There was no guilt in his eyes. There was not even a flicker of hesitation. Instead, he flashed a wide, arrogant smile and threw his arms open wide. "Look who finally decided to join us," Derek announced loudly, making sure his friends heard every word. "The future chief financial officer of my empire." His friends chuckled, looking me up and down in my wrinkled worksuit. I stood there, a mixture of pure exhaustion and disbelief, anchoring my feet to the patio stones. "Derek, what is going on here?" I asked, my voice tight. "Who massive truck is blocking my driveway?" Derek waved his tongs dismissively in the air. "Oh, do not worry about that, babe. That is just a minor business expense. You have to look the part to get the big investors on board. Image is everything in the tech world. Anyway, you are home at the perfect time." He walked over not to kiss me or ask how my grueling 16-hour workday was, but to shove an empty ceramic bowl into my hands. "The guys and I are starving," he commanded, his tone completely devoid of any respect. The steaks are taking too long. Run into the kitchen and whip us up a couple of large trays of those loaded nachos you make. Extra jalapenos. My future board of directors needs fuel for our brainstorming session. I stared down at the empty bowl in my hands. A board of directors. These men could not even direct themselves out of a paper bag, let alone run a tech company. My feet ADHD. My eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets all day. And my husband was ordering me to play a short order cook at midnight for his unemployed friends. The sheer audacity of his request echoed in my ears over the loud music. I looked from the bowl up to Derek's smug, expectant face and then over to the driveway where that expensive truck sat shining in the dark. A dangerous icy calm began to settle over my chest. I did not throw the bowl. I did not yell. I simply gripped the ceramic edge and turned toward the back door of the house. I stepped into the kitchen and let the heavy glass sliding door click shut behind me. The thumping bass from the backyard instantly muffled into a dull vibration against the floorboards. I set the empty ceramic bowl on the granite counter with a sharp clatter. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of pure outrage. I needed a moment to breathe before I made those ridiculous nachos. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket, intending to check the time. It was 11:40. I suddenly remembered that the electric bill was due at midnight. And with Derek blowing our household budget on premium steaks and craft beer, I needed to make sure the autopay would not bounce. I opened my mobile banking app, the bright screen stinging my tired eyes. I navigated to our joint checking account. The balance was a pathetic $200. I let out a heavy sigh, tapping the screen to switch to my personal savings account so I could transfer over enough to cover the utility bill. But as the account overview page loaded, my eyes caught a discrepancy on the third row down. It was the line item for the $529 college savings plan I had set up for our twins, Leo and Mia. The balance read $0 and $0. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, assuming the app was glitching. The servers often ran maintenance late at night. I swiped down to refresh the page. The loading wheel spun for 2 agonizing seconds before the screen settled. $0. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I tapped directly into the 529 account portfolio. The transaction history was entirely blank. Panic sharp and suffocating seized my chest. I quickly opened my mobile web browser and navigated directly to the dedicated investment portal for the college fund. I typed in my username and entered the password I had used for the last 5 years. Error. Incorrect password. I typed it again slower this time, making sure my trembling fingers hit the right keys. Error. Account locked due to suspicious activity or changed credentials. I immediately switched over to my email app and frantically typed the name of the investment firm into the search bar. I scrolled past the monthly newsletters and routine policy updates until I found a cluster of automated emails from Tuesday morning hidden away in my deleted folder. Someone had manually moved them there. I tapped the first one. Password change request initiated. I tapped the second. Email address updated successfully. I tapped the third and the text on the screen made my stomach violently drop. Withdrawal complete. $45. 000 has been transferred to an external account. I braced my hands against the kitchen island so I would not fall over. $45. 000. It was every single penny I had saved since the day I found out I was pregnant with the twins. My mind raced, flashing back to the source of those funds. I opened my digital archive of bank statements on my phone, pulling up the PDFs from the last 5 years. I scrolled frantically through the pages, the numbers blurring together into a timeline of my own exhaustion. There was the $200 deposit from January 3 years ago, money I made auditing a small bakery on a Sunday afternoon while Derek watched football. There was the $500 deposit from last November, The holiday bonus from the medical supply company that I chose to invest instead of spending on a new winter coat for myself. Line after line of deposits varying from $50 to $1,000. All of it representing missed weekends, late nights, and double shifts. I had worked myself to the bone staring at spreadsheets until my vision blurred just to make sure Leo and Mia would not have to take out predatory student loans when they turned 18. And now it was gone. I went back to the joint checking account history and dug deeper, expanding the transaction details from the past 48 hours. There it was. An incoming transfer of $45,000 from the college fund deposited on Tuesday afternoon. 2 hours later, an outgoing wire transfer for the exact same amount. The recipient name was crystal clear. It was the luxury auto dealership across town. The $80,000 truck sitting in my driveway had not been bought with investor capital. Derek had used the children's entire future as a down payment for his ego. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He had logged into my computer, accessed my secure passwords, bypassed the security questions, and completely wiped out 5 years of my blood and sweat. He did all of this to buy a truck to impress unemployed men drinking beer on my patio. The sliding glass door rattled on its tracks, breaking the heavy silence in the kitchen. Derek strolled in an empty beer bottle dangling from his fingers. Right behind him, wiping her hands on one of my expensive decorative kitchen towels, was his mother, Barbara. She had apparently let herself in through the front door while I was having my quiet panic attack. Barbara lived 10 minutes away and treated my home like her personal country club, frequently dropping by unannounced to make sure I was keeping her precious son comfortable. Derek frowned at the empty counter. He asked where the nachos were, complaining that the guys were getting restless out there. I did not move toward the pantry. I did not reach for a cutting board. I simply picked up my phone, turned the screen brightness all the way up, and held it up so the glaring zero balance was facing him. I asked him exactly where the $45,000 from the twins' college fund had gone. My voice was eerily calm, completely devoid of the hysterical pitch he was probably expecting. Derek rolled his eyes and sighed loudly, acting as if I had just asked him to take out the trash. He told me to relax, claiming the money was not gone, but simply reallocated. He admitted he transferred it to the joint account and then wired it to the luxury dealership. He stated, "You cannot park a 10-year-old sedan in the driveway when you are inviting high-net-worth individuals over to pitch a tech startup because it screams desperation." He insisted he needed an executive vehicle to project success. Before I could even process the sheer delusion of calling a lifted pickup truck an executive vehicle, Barbara stepped directly between us. She crossed her arms, her diamond rings glinting under the pendant lights that I had paid for. She snapped at me, ordering me not to raise my voice at her son, even though I had spoken at a perfectly normal volume. She declared, "He is the head of this household and he makes the executive decisions." She told me if he says he needs a luxury truck to secure angel investors, then he needs a luxury truck. According to her, I should have been thanking him for taking the initiative to elevate our family. Thanking him. I repeated the words slowly, tasting the absolute absurdity of them. I looked right at Barbara and explained that he stole the money. I laid out the facts, stating he hacked into my secure investment portal, changed the passwords, and drained 5 years of savings that I earned working double shifts. He took his own children's college money to buy a toy for himself. Derek interjected, grabbing a handful of grapes from the fruit bowl and tossing one into his mouth. He argued it was not a toy, but a vital business expense. He promised that once he secured funding for his app, he would put the money back and probably double it. He accused me of overreacting over a temporary cash flow adjustment. Barbara nodded vigorously in agreement, stepping closer to me with a look of pure condescension. She sneered that this was exactly why Derek was the visionary and I was just the bookkeeper. She accused me of having a small impoverished mindset. She said, "I sit at a desk all day punching numbers on a calculator and counting pennies while her son is out here trying to build an empire." She told me, "I simply do not understand how high-level business works," adding her favorite cliché that you have to spend money to make money. I stared at her. The woman who had not held a job since the late 90s was lecturing me about high-level business. I looked at Derek, the visionary, who was currently wiping grape juice on his expensive new polo shirt. He looked entirely unbothered by the fact that he had just committed financial ruin on his own children. He felt completely justified because his mother had spent his entire life validating his worst impulses. Barbara continued her tirade, her tone dripping with fake pity. She claimed I worked 2 jobs because I chose to be a martyr. She said if I actually supported my husband instead of nagging him, maybe his stress levels would be lower and he could have launched his company years ago. But no. She said I always had to make him feel small and I refused to let him lead. She told me he was leading now and I needed to get used to it. Frankly, she added, those children do not need $45,000 sitting uselessly in a bank account when their father is on the verge of becoming a millionaire. The sheer level of toxicity in the room was suffocating. Any normal wife might have screamed. Any normal mother might have grabbed the nearest heavy object and smashed it against the granite island. But the anger inside me had burned past the point of explosive rage. It had crystallized into something cold, sharp, and highly calculated. They thought I was just a small-minded bookkeeper. They thought my silence was submission. They had no idea that my job involved forensic financial tracking, identifying corporate fraud, and systematically destroying people who thought they could embezzle funds without consequences. Derek clapped his hands together, completely misreading my silence as defeat. He happily announced he was glad we cleared that up and then demanded the nachos again, complaining his friends needed food. I looked at my husband. Really looked at him. Perhaps for the final time as his wife. I told him quietly to make his own nachos because I was going to bed. As I walked past them toward the stairs, I heard Barbara scoff behind me. She told Derek my behavior was exactly what she meant. Citing my zero supportive energy, she promised she would make the food for his guests instead. I walked up the hardwood stairs, each step feeling lighter than the last. Let them eat nachos. Let them celebrate the new truck. They had absolutely no idea what I was about to unleash upon them. I reached the landing of the stairs, but my feet stopped moving. The anger inside me demanded immediate action. I could not just go to sleep and let the shock paralyze me. I turned around my footsteps, completely silent on the carpeted runner, and descended back to the first floor. I slipped past the kitchen hallway where Barbara was aggressively banging pots and pans around to make her son's precious food, and stepped into the large walk-in pantry tucked under the staircase. I pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me, plunging myself into the comforting darkness. Smelling of dried pasta and cinnamon, I leaned against the cool wire shelving, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to my favorites list. I bypassed my sister, Nora, and tapped the contact right below her name, Jamal. Jamal was my brother-in-law. He was a brilliant, no-nonsense African-American forensic accountant who spent his days dismantling corporate embezzlement rings and tracing hidden assets for a top-tier financial firm downtown. Jamal had never liked Derek. He saw through the startup founder facade the very first time they met at a family Thanksgiving 5 years ago. Jamal was a man built on integrity and hard work, the exact opposite of the parasite I had married. The phone rang twice before Jamal answered. His voice was a deep, growly baritone, steady and alert despite the late hour. "Olivia, are you okay?" he asked, the protective instinct immediately evident in his tone. "It is almost midnight." "Jamal. He did it." I whispered into the darkness of the pantry, my voice remarkably steady. He crossed the line. Execute the contingency plan. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The contingency plan was something Jamal and I had quietly mapped out a year ago, back when Derek had almost gotten us audited over a disastrous cryptocurrency scheme. Jamal had warned me then that Derek's financial recklessness would eventually escalate from foolishness to outright theft. He told me to be ready for the day Derek finally crossed the point of no return. Tell me exactly what he took. Jamal said, his tone instantly shifting from a concerned family member to a lethal financial investigator. He hacked into the twins' college savings account. I replied, my grip tightening on the phone. He changed the passwords and drained the entire $45,000. He wired it to the luxury auto dealership across town to buy an $80,000 truck. It is sitting in my driveway right now. I heard the sound of a chair scraping against a hardwood floor on Jamal's end, followed by the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard. He was already at his home office desk. That money was in a federally protected 529 college savings plan. Jamal stated, his voice laced with professional disgust. That is not just marital financial abuse, Olivia. That is wire fraud. He used a digital network to unlawfully transfer protected funds across state lines for a personal asset. He has handed us the exact weapon we need to destroy him legally. I know, I said. And Barbara is here. She is defending him. She told me the truck is a necessary business expense and that I have an impoverished mindset for being upset about it. Jamal let out a short, humorless laugh. Barbara is going to need a lot more than a positive mindset when I am done tracking his digital footprint. Listen to me carefully. Do not confront him anymore tonight. Do not let him know you are on to the legal reality of what he has done. Let him think he won this argument. I am locking down your personal credit right now, and I will begin pulling the forensic data from the bank servers first thing in the morning. Thank you, Jamal, I said softly. We are family. Olivia. We protect our own, he replied firmly. Let him drive that truck. It is the most expensive mistake he will ever make. I ended the call. The suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest for the last hour instantly evaporated. I was no longer a victim trapped in a toxic marriage. I was a trap about to snap shut. I opened the pantry door and stepped out into the hallway. The bright lights of the kitchen made me blink. Derek was walking out of the kitchen carrying a massive plate of loaded nachos dripping with cheese, heading toward the sliding glass door to rejoin his friends. He stopped when he saw me standing in the hallway. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. I thought you went to bed, he muttered, adjusting his grip on the heavy plate. If you came back down to argue about the truck again, you can save it. I am not letting your negativity ruin my networking session. I looked at him. I looked at his arrogant posture, his designer shirt bought with my money, and the absolute certainty in his eyes that I would just submit and cry myself to sleep like I had so many times before. I tilted my head and a slow, genuinely cold smile spread across my face. I am not going to argue with you, Derek, I said, my voice smooth as glass. You are absolutely right. You are the visionary. You needed an executive vehicle. Derek blinked clearly, caught off guard by my sudden shift in demeanor. His shoulders relaxed slightly and a smug smirk returned to his lips. He thought he had broken me. He thought Barbara's lecture had put me back in my place. Exactly, he said, puffing out his chest. I am glad you finally see the bigger picture. When this app launches, you will realize this was the best investment we ever made. I stepped aside, gesturing gracefully toward the back door where the loud music was still playing. Go on, I told him, holding my cold smile perfectly in place. Your board of directors is waiting. Enjoy the truck, Derek. Enjoy every single second of it. He gave me a weird lingering look, unnerved by my complete lack of tears. But his ego quickly overrode his intuition. He pushed the glass door open and walked out into the night. Greeted by the loud cheers of his friends, I stood in the quiet hallway, listening to them celebrate a man who had just signed his own financial death warrant. The alarm clock went off at 6 o'clock in the morning, pulling me from a restless 3 hours of sleep. My body ADHD from the double shift the day before, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I got out of bed, dressed the twins, and fed them their morning oatmeal. Leo and Mia were blissfully unaware of the financial earthquake that had struck our family the night before. I packed their little backpacks, kissed their foreheads, and dropped them off at daycare before heading back to the house to grab my work laptop. When I walked back into the kitchen at 8:30, the lingering smell of stale beer and cigar smoke still hung in the air from the patio. Derek was finally awake. He sauntered down the wooden staircase, wearing expensive silk pajama pants, aggressively rubbing his temples as if he were the one carrying the weight of the world. He poured himself a mug of the coffee I had brewed earlier, and slumped onto a bar stool at the kitchen island. There was absolutely no trace of remorse on his face. No apology for stealing $45. 000. No guilt for treating me like garbage in front of his friends. Instead of a good morning, he slid a folded piece of notebook paper across the granite countertop toward me. "I need you to clear your schedule for this Friday night," he announced, his voice raspy from a craft beer hangover. "Cancel your bookkeeping clients. Call out of your corporate job if you have to. We are hosting a pitch dinner right here in the dining room." I stared at the folded paper, making no move to pick it up. "A pitch dinner," I repeated flatly. "Yes," Derek said, leaning forward with a sudden burst of arrogant energy. "A massive angel investor is coming over. This guy is a heavyweight in the tech industry. He funds multi-million-dollar startups for breakfast. I finally got his attention, and I'm going to pitch my app over a private intimate dinner. It shows confidence and personal touch." I reached out and unfolded the piece of paper. It was a grocery list written in his messy scroll. But it was not a normal grocery list. It read like the inventory of a Michelin star restaurant. Wagyu beef ribeyes, imported Italian truffle oil, Spanish saffron, 3 specific types of artisanal French cheeses, oysters, 2 bottles of a very specific red wine that I knew cost over $200 each. "I expect a 5-course gourmet meal," Derek commanded, taking a loud sip of his coffee. "And presentation matters. Olivia, do not just slop the food onto the plates like you do on a regular weeking night. I need you to serve us properly course by course. I need this investor to see that my home life is organized and luxurious. It projects stability." I read down the list again, feeling a bitter laugh rising in my throat, though I swallowed it down. He was effectively treating me like a hired servant in my own home. I looked up from the paper and met his bloodshot eyes. "Derek," I said slowly, keeping my voice perfectly level, "you drained our savings account yesterday. The joint checking account has exactly $200 in it. How exactly do you expect me to pay for Wagyu beef and imported truffles?" He waved his hand dismissively, an irritated sigh escaping his lips. "Just put it on your personal credit cards. Figure it out. Consider it an investment in our family future. Once this investor signs a term sheet, I will pay off your little credit card balances in a week. Do not make a big deal out of nothing." He was so incredibly blind. He had no idea that Jamal had already locked down my credit profiles the night before to protect me from any further financial sabotage. But I did not tell him that. I did not point out the sheer insanity of asking a woman working 2 jobs to finance a luxury dinner party for the man who just robbed her children. I simply folded the piece of paper and slipped it into the pocket of my work blazer. "I will take care of the dinner on Friday," I told him, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "I will make sure everything is exactly what you deserve." Derek smiled a wide, self-satisfied grin that made my stomach turn. Good, he said, patting the countertop. I am glad you are finally acting like a supportive partner. Just stay out of the way while we talk business. You can stay in the kitchen between courses. I turned my back to him and picked up my laptop bag. I agreed to play the obedient, silent wife. I agreed to cook his ridiculous 5-course meal and serve him like a maid. Because what Derek did not know was that Friday night was not going to be a pitch dinner. It was going to be an execution. I drove to my corporate office with a bizarre sense of clarity. The entire workday felt like a countdown. Between approving budget reports and managing my finance team, I texted Jamal from a secure messaging app. He confirmed he was pulling the digital transaction logs and asked me to meet him for lunch the following day. I agreed, shut my laptop at 5 o'clock sharp, and headed home. Normally, the drive back to the suburbs was filled with a lingering dread of what mood Derek might be in. Today, I felt nothing but cold anticipation when I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. However, my anticipation quickly morphed into fresh disbelief. The first thing I noticed was the massive pile of luggage. 3 enormous hard-shell suitcases were stacked haphazardly next to the entryway console table. I recognized them immediately. They belonged to Barbara. Before I could even process why her luggage was in my house, a loud scraping sound echoed from the living room. I walked past the stairs and stopped dead in my tracks. The entire layout of the main floor had been altered. My favorite reading chair, the one I bought with my first promotion bonus, was shoved carelessly into a dark corner. The decorative rugs were rolled up, and standing in the center of the room, pointing aggressively at the walls, was my mother-in-law. Barbara turned around when she heard my footsteps. She did not look like a guest dropping by for a short visit. She was wearing comfortable house slippers and had a measuring tape draped around her neck. I am moving in, she announced. Not as a request, but as an absolute decree. Do not look so shocked, Olivia. Someone has to supervise the preparation for Friday night. I stared at her, then down at her slippers. Moving in. You live 10 minutes away, I stated slowly. Barbara waved her hand, dismissing my logic entirely. 10 minutes is too far when there is an executive event to coordinate. Derek is on the verge of a multi-million-dollar breakthrough. He needs a serene, perfectly organized environment. Honestly, I cannot trust you to provide that. You are always so distracted with your little accounting side hustles. I will be staying in the guest room permanently until the startup takes off and he can buy a proper estate. Permanently. The sheer audacity of the word hung in the air. She was planning to comfortably nest in my home. The home I paid the mortgage on to wait for an imaginary payday funded by my children's stolen college money. I took a deep breath, scanning the room again. That is when I noticed the heavy black garbage bag sitting by the fireplace. Protruding from the top of one bag was the edge of a framed photograph along with several of my favorite decorative throw pillows and the custom knitted blanket my sister Nora had made for the twins. My stomach tightened. I walked over and pulled the frame out of the trash. It was a picture of my late father, a man who had actually worked hard every day of his life. What is this? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. Why are my personal belongings in the garbage? Barbara sighed loudly, as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. I am decluttering, she said simply. Your taste is incredibly drab, Olivia. Those cheap little picture frames and your woven baskets do not project wealth. Richard Harrison is a man of high standards. When he walks into this house on Friday, he needs to see a blank modern canvas, not a shrine to your middle-class upbringing. I threw out all the clutter so we can rent some high-end staging furniture tomorrow. She had thrown away my family photos. She had discarded pieces of my life to create a fake billionaire aesthetic for her unemployed son. A surge of pure unadulterated rage spiked behind my eyes. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and throw her out the front door. I wanted to scream that she was standing inside a house that legally belonged solely to me. I wanted to tell her that her precious son was a felon in the making. But I remembered Jamal's warning. Do not let them know you are on to the legal reality. Let them think they won. I carefully wiped the dust off my father's picture frame and held it tightly against my chest. I forced my facial muscles to relax. I swallowed the fire in my throat and looked at Barbara with a blank, defeated expression. You are right, I said softly. Barbara blinked clearly, prepared for a screaming match. Excuse me, she asked. I said you are right, I repeated, making my voice sound as tired and submissive as possible. Derek needs this to be perfect. If you think staying here and redesigning the living room will help him secure the investment, then the guest room is yours. Do whatever you need to do. Barbara. Her suspicious glare slowly melted into a triumphant smirk. She truly believed she had finally broken my spirit. She gave a curt nod and went right back to measuring the walls for her rented furniture. I turned around and walked up the stairs, clutching the photograph. They were rearranging the furniture on the deck of a sinking ship, and I was holding the only life raft. I just needed to make it to my lunch meeting with Jamal the next day. At exactly noon the following day, I stepped out of the glass doors of my corporate building and walked 3 blocks to a small, dimly lit independent coffee shop. The lunchtime rush had not fully started yet, making the space relatively quiet. I scanned the room and immediately spotted Jamal sitting in a back corner booth. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his posture rigid, and his demeanor radiating the quiet, intimidating confidence of a man who spent his life unraveling complex financial webs. Resting on the scratched wooden table in front of him was a thick red folder. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him. He had already ordered me a black coffee, knowing I would need the caffeine after a sleepless night under the same roof as my mother-in-law. How is the homorant? Jamal asked, his dark eyes analyzing my exhausted expression. Barbara moved in, I replied flatly, wrapping my cold hands around the warm coffee mug. She threw away my family photos to make room for rented staging furniture. She wants the house to look like a billionaire's bachelor pad for the pitch dinner on Friday night. She told me my taste was too middle class. Jamal let out a low rumbling chuckle that lacked any real humor. The absolute arrogance of that family will never cease to amaze me, he said, shaking his head. He tapped his long fingers against the top of the red folder. It is actually deeply ironic that Barbara is redecorating the house and treating you like a servant. Considering who actually owns the property. He slid the red folder across the table toward me. I opened it carefully. Lying on top of a stack of dense financial logs was a crisp official document bearing the blue seal of the county clerk. It was a quick claim deed. I pulled the official property records from the county database this morning just to ensure everything was ironclad. Jamal explained, keeping his voice low so the barista wiping down the counter could not hear. As a forensic accountant, I never trust a memory. I need paper trails. I needed to make sure Derek never quietly tried to reverse the filing. But there it is. Olivia. 100% sole ownership legally recorded and filed exclusively in your name. I stare down at the document, my eyes locking onto Derek's messy signature at the bottom of the page. The memory of the day he signed it rushed back to me with crystal clarity. It was exactly 14 months ago. Derek had come home pale, sweating and on the verge of a panic attack, clutching an audit notice from the Internal Revenue Service. He had been running an unregistered cryptocurrency trading scheme with his unemployed friends and had completely failed to report any of his capital gains or losses. Terrified that the federal government was going to place a tax lien on our home and seize his assets to cover the massive penalties, he had begged me to let him transfer the deed entirely into my name. He was literally crying in our kitchen when he signed this. I recalled my finger tracing the notary stamp next to his name. He said signing the house over to me was the only way to protect our family from his mistake. He swore up and down that he would get a real job and stop playing with crypto after the audit blew over. Jamal leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. And instead of getting a job, he drained his own children's education fund to buy a truck. The beauty of a narcissist like Derek is that they have incredibly short memories when it comes to their own failures. He signed this quitclaim deed to save his own skin, viewing it as a temporary legal loophole to trick the government. In his delusional mind, he still thinks of that house as his castle. He has completely forgotten that legally he is nothing more than a tenant living on your property. I closed the red folder, the heavy weight of the document making me feel grounded for the first time in 48 hours. So when Barbara says she is moving in permanently to supervise me, she is actually threatening the landlord. I said, a genuine dark smile finally touching my lips. Exactly, Jamal said, his expression remaining deadly serious. Every time they disrespect you in that house, I want you to remember that you hold the keys. But you cannot play this card yet. Olivia. A quitclaim deed is a powerful shield. But it is not the sword we need to finish this. Let Barbara decorate. Let Derek play the wealthy host and order you around. Let them dig their graves a little deeper. Because what I found in his bank records this morning is much worse than just stealing from a college fund. I felt a cold chill wash over me as Jamal spoke. Worse than stealing from our children? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jamal. What else could he possibly have done? Jamal did not answer right away. He reached back into the thick red folder and pulled out a second stack of papers. These pages were stapled together bearing the logo of a major national bank. He placed the stack directly in front of me, tapping his index finger on the bold heading at the top of the first page. Read it, he instructed quietly. I leaned forward and scanned the document. It was a home equity line of credit agreement commonly known as a HELOC. My eyes jumped to the principal amount listed on the second line. $100. 000. The blood rushed out of my face, leaving me lightheaded. He took out a second mortgage on the house. I breathed out the words feeling heavy on my tongue. He leveraged the equity I have been building for the last 10 years to borrow $100. 000. Jamal nodded slowly. He applied for it 3 weeks ago. The bank approved it last Friday and the funds were deposited into his personal checking account yesterday morning right before he went to the dealership to buy that absurd luxury truck. I shook my head, my mind struggling to process the logistics of the crime. But that is impossible, I argued, looking up at Jamal. We just established that the house is legally 100% mine. He signed the quitclaim deed over a year ago. No bank in this country would approve a home equity loan against a property without the explicit legally binding consent of the primary title holder. I never spoke to a loan officer. I never signed any paperwork. Turned to the last page. Jamal said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. I flipped through the dense legal jargon until I reached the signature section. There, printed on the bottom line, was my name. Next to it was a signature that looked remarkably like mine. The loop of the O and the sharp slant of the V were almost perfectly replicated. But as a finance manager who spent hours reviewing signed contracts every single day, I could immediately spot the hesitation in the pen strokes. It was a tracing job. He had likely used a piece of mail or an old check to copy my handwriting. He forged my signature, I said, staring at the blue ink. My own husband forged my signature on federal bank documents. He did, Jamal confirmed. And he did not just forge your signature, Olivia. He orchestrated a complete fraudulent filing. Look at the notary stamp right below your forged name. I shifted my gaze downward. There was a circular black ink stamp from a public notary certifying that I had supposedly presented my government identification and signed the document in person. The notary's name listed was someone I had never heard of before. I ran that notary commission number through the state registry first thing this morning. Jamal explained, leaning back in the booth and crossing his arms. The commission number is completely fake. The name belongs to one of those unemployed buddies who was drinking beer on your patio last night. He bought a fake notary stamp online for $20 to make the paperwork look legitimate to the automated bank processing system. They submitted the entire application digitally, bypassing the need to sit in front of a real loan officer. I sat back against the vinyl seat of the booth. The sheer scale of Derek's betrayal crushing the breath out of my lungs. He had not just made a stupid financial mistake. He had premeditated a massive coordinated fraud. He had stolen my identity, forged my signature, falsified legal documents, and defrauded a major financial institution for $100,000. And he did it all while eating the dinners I cooked, spending the money I earned, and sleeping in the bed I paid for. This is not just a bad husband taking advantage of his wife, Jamal said, his tone turning razor sharp. This is felony bank fraud. This is aggravated identity theft. This is conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The federal government does not take lightly to people manipulating the banking system with fake notary stamps. Derek is not looking at a simple divorce court hearing, Olivia. He is looking at severe federal prison time. My hands started to shake. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization of the power I now held. The man who had ordered me to make nachos for his friends, the man whose mother was currently treating me like a maid in my own home, was a walking felon. He thought he was a genius tech founder. He was actually just a common criminal who had left a digital paper trail a mile long. What do we do? I asked, my voice hardening into something cold and resolute. Jamal leaned forward again, a fierce glint in his dark eyes. We let him hang himself, he said. Hang himself. I repeated, my voice rising a fraction before I caught myself and lowered it. Jamal, I am not waiting around for him to hang himself. He forged a legal document and put a $100,000 lien on my house. I am calling the police right now. I reached into my purse, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of my phone. I wanted to dial the authorities, have squad cars surround my house and watch them drag Derek out in handcuffs before the afternoon was over. Jamal reached across the table and placed his large hand firmly over mine, stopping me from pulling the phone out of my bag. Listen to me very carefully, Olivia, Jamal said, his voice dropping into a tone of absolute authority. If you call the local police right now, they will arrest him for forgery. It is a state-level crime. He will hire a sleazy defense attorney who will argue that this is just a messy marital dispute. They will claim you gave verbal consent for the loan and are now lying out of spite. Best case scenario, he gets a slap on the wrist, probation, and a mountain of legal debt that somehow gets tied to you in the divorce. I stared at Jamal, my heart pounding against my ribs. I asked him what other option we had if we did not call the police immediately. We wait, Jamal stated simply. We wait until he moves the money. Right now, that $100,000 is sitting untouched in a domestic checking account. But I know Derek. I know his patterns from the tax audit last year. He does not hold on to cash. He is going to try and hide it. He thinks he is a financial genius, which means he is going to funnel that stolen equity into unregulated cryptocurrency. Jamal pulled out his tablet and opened a secure financial tracking dashboard. He pointed to a pending transaction authorization that he had intercepted through his forensic software. He has already initiated the setup process with an offshore crypto exchange, Jamal explained, tapping the screen. He is planning to buy a massive block of junk digital coins. He thinks if he converts the cash to crypto, it becomes untraceable and he can avoid capital gains taxes when his imaginary startup takes off. But the clearing process takes 3 business days for an amount this large. I looked at the pending transaction on the screen, feeling a sickening mixture of disgust and clarity. I asked Jamal what happens when the transaction actually clears. When that money crosses state lines and hits an international server. The game completely changes. Jamal said, leaning back and folding his arms. It stops being a local domestic dispute. It elevates to federal wire fraud. That is a Class C felony under federal law. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice do not care about marital misunderstandings. They care about financial crimes involving federally insured banks and interstate commerce. If we wait for the wire to clear, Derek is looking at a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. No probation. No slap on the wrist. The sheer gravity of Jamal's words settled over the table. Federal wire fraud prison. The stakes were incredibly high. But they were finally tipped in my favor. When does the wire transfer clear? I asked. My voice steadying as the strategy crystallized in my mind. Friday afternoon. Jamal confirmed. Right around the time you are supposed to be preparing that ridiculous 5-course meal for his fake investor. Which means for the next 3 days you have to go back to that house and play the role he expects you to play. You have to be the submissive, supportive wife. You cannot give him a single reason to panic and cancel that transfer. I thought about the massive pile of luggage sitting in my foyer. I thought about Barbara rearranging my furniture and treating me like hired help. I thought about Derek parading around in his expensive polo shirts, barking orders at me while spending the money he stole from our children. The idea of biting my tongue and serving them for 3 more days felt like swallowing broken glass. But then I thought about the quit-claim deed safely secured in Jamal's folder. I thought about the federal arrest warrant that was brewing with every passing hour. I can do it, I told Jamal. My voice. Cold and absolute. I will cook the Wagyu beef. I will let Barbara decorate the living room with her rented furniture. I will smile and serve the wine. I will give him exactly 3 days of complete obedience. Jamal gave a curt satisfied nod. I will monitor the wire transfer around the clock. The second the funds cross state lines on Friday. I am taking all of this evidence directly to my contacts at the district attorney's office. We will have the federal warrants ready before the appetizers are even served. I stood up from the booth, leaving my untouched coffee on the table. The terrified, exhausted woman who had driven home last night no longer existed. I walked out of the coffee shop and headed back to my corporate office armed with the most dangerous weapon a woman could possess. I had the truth and I was entirely prepared to use it. I drove home that Wednesday evening with Jamal's instructions echoing in my mind. I needed to be the perfect submissive wife for 3 more days. When I pulled into the driveway, Derek was nowhere to be seen, likely out driving his fraudulently obtained truck. I unlocked the front door and stepped into a house that felt less like my home and more like a hostile territory. The living room was completely stripped bare. Barbara had made good on her threat to clear out my belongings, leaving the space looking cold and empty. She was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a glass of wine and aggressively swiping through an expensive tablet. When she heard my work heels click against the hardwood floor, she did not bother to look up. She simply tapped the screen of the tablet and shoved it across the granite countertop toward me. "Look at this," Barbara commanded. I spent all day dealing with those incompetent staging companies. Their rental furniture looks cheap and completely lacks the executive presence Richard Harrison will expect. I found a much better solution. I looked down at the screen. It was an interior design website displaying a massive imported Italian leather sofa set. Below the image was a price tag of $10. 000. "I need you to order this right now," Barbara said, taking a slow sip of her wine. "Pay for the expedited overnight freight shipping so they can deliver and assemble it by tomorrow afternoon. It will set the perfect tone for the pitch dinner." I stared at the $10,000 price tag, feeling a familiar knot of frustration tighten in my stomach. I looked up at my mother-in-law. "Barbara," I said, keeping my tone intentionally soft and defeated. I cannot buy a $10,000 sofa set. Derek emptied our joint accounts yesterday. I barely have enough available credit left on my personal cards to buy the Wagyu beef and truffles for the dinner. Barbara rolled her eyes, slamming her wine glass down on the counter. Do not play poor with me. Olivia. You have a 401k retirement account through that medical supply company you work for. I know you do. Cash it out. The sheer audacity of her demand actually made me laugh, a short breathless sound of disbelief. Liquidate my retirement account? I asked, clarifying just how insane her request was. Barbara. Cashing out a 401k early incurs massive federal tax penalties. It takes days to process and it would completely wipe out my future financial security. I am not destroying my retirement to buy a leather couch. Barbara stood up, her face flushing with sudden anger. She hated being told no, especially by the woman she viewed as nothing more than an obstacle to her son's greatness. Your retirement. She mocked, her voice rising sharply. You are so incredibly selfish. When Derek secures this funding, he is going to be a multimillionaire. You will not need a pathetic corporate pension. But he cannot get that funding if his house looks like a cheap motel. You are actively sabotaging your own husband. I shook my head, deciding to show just enough resistance to make my act believable. If I agreed to everything too quickly, Derek and Barbara might get suspicious. I will cook the 5-course meal, I told her firmly. I will serve the wine. But I am not touching my retirement account. That is my final answer. I reached into my bag, pulled out my expensive corporate laptop, and set it on the kitchen island. I opened the screen and began typing in my password, pretending I needed to catch up on some bookkeeping work. I wanted to end the conversation and retreat into my digital tasks. Barbara stood in silence for a few seconds, breathing heavily through her nose. She walked over to the coffee maker, which was sitting just a few feet away from my laptop. She picked up the large glass carafe, which was still half full of scalding hot black coffee from earlier that afternoon. She turned around, took 2 steps toward me, and deliberately stumbled. With a sharp gasp of fake surprise, she tilted the glass carafe forward. A waterfall of steaming dark liquid poured directly over the keyboard of my work laptop. I jumped back as the hot coffee splashed across the granite, narrowly missing my hands. The laptop screen flickered wildly for a split second before emitting a sharp static hiss. A tiny wisp of smoke curled up from the keyboard and the screen went completely black. The motherboard was fried instantly. Oops, Barbara said. Her voice held absolutely no trace of genuine regret. She stood there holding the empty glass carafe, a wicked, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. Clumsy me. But honestly, Olivia, maybe you should not leave your little accounting toys out in the open when adults are trying to coordinate important business matters. I stood there staring at the ruined piece of hardware. Any normal person would have screamed. I could have easily thrown the rest of my own coffee right back in her face. But the image of the red folder Jamal had given me flashed vividly in my mind. Federal wire fraud. I took a slow, deep breath, burying my rage deep within my chest. My corporate IT department would replace the laptop by tomorrow morning for free. But Barbara did not know that. She thought she had destroyed my livelihood. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply grabbed a roll of paper towels, gave her a cold, empty smile, and started wiping the coffee off the counter. The clock was ticking, and Friday was approaching fast. I threw the coffee-soaked paper towels into the trash and spent the rest of Wednesday evening pretending everything was perfectly fine. Thursday arrived with a suffocating tension. It was the day before the pitch dinner. After securing a replacement laptop from my corporate IT department, I left work early to start prepping the 5-course menu Derek had demanded. I was standing in my kitchen marinating the overpriced Wagyu beef I had been forced to charge to my almost maxed out credit card when I heard the heavy roar of Derek's truck pulling into the driveway. The front door clicked open. Derek did not walk into the kitchen alone. Trailing closely behind him was a woman I instantly recognized. Her name was Kelsey. She was Derek's ex-girlfriend from his mid-20s. A woman who currently branded herself as a local lifestyle and wellness influencer on social media. She walked into my house wearing an incredibly tight workout set and carrying an oversized designer tote bag. The scent of her overpowering floral perfume immediately masked the smell of the garlic and herbs I was carefully chopping. Derek puffed out his chest and proudly announced he had brought in an expert. He claimed he had just hired Kelsey as his official brand consultant for the pitch dinner tomorrow night. He explained that Richard Harrison was a man who invested in the founder just as much as the product. So his personal aesthetic and energy needed to be absolutely flawless. He casually mentioned he had paid Kelsey a $5,000 retainer to curate his wardrobe and optimize his public speaking body language. $5,000. He had taken more of the forged loan money to hire his ex-girlfriend to tell him how to stand and what shirts to wear. The sheer brazenness of it made my pulse quicken. I casually wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, reached into my blazer pocket, and pulled out my phone. Under the guise of checking a recipe online, I opened the voice memo app, hit the red record button, and placed the phone face down on the granite island right next to the cutting board. Kelsey completely ignored the fact that I was the woman paying the mortgage on the house she was standing in. She leaned against the counter, her arm deliberately brushing against Derek's, and looked me up and down. She let out a soft, patronizing sigh. She told Derek it was a good thing he hired her because the energy in the house was entirely too corporate and rigid. She pointed a perfectly manicured fingernail at my sensible navy blue work slacks and white blouse. Kelsey giggled and told me I looked like a tired bank teller. She advised me to stay completely out of sight during the pitch dinner because my exhausted working-class vibe would severely clash with the high-value aesthetic Derek was trying to project to the investor. She actually suggested I hide in the pantry while the investor was in the dining room. Derek did not defend me. He nodded in agreement, telling Kelsey she had a great eye for detail and that he had already instructed me to play the role of the silent caterer anyway. Kelsey then stepped closer to Derek, playfully adjusting the collar of his shirt. She practically purred as she told him he was destined for greatness and that it was a tragedy he had spent so many years being held back by people who simply did not understand the daily grind of an alpha entrepreneur. She was openly flirting with my husband in my kitchen while I prepared his food and my phone was recording every single syllable of their transaction. Barbara walked into the kitchen right at that moment, having heard the commotion from the living room. Instead of questioning why her son's ex-girlfriend was rubbing his shoulders, Barbara greeted Kelsey with a warm, enthusiastic hug. Barbara told Kelsey it was so refreshing to finally have a woman in the house who understood high society standards. They stood there, a unified front of delusion, completely disregarding my existence. I picked up my chef knife and resumed chopping the garlic. I did not glare at Kelsey. I did not demand she leave my property. I maintained the exact same deadpan submissive expression I had been wearing for the past 2 days. I calmly asked Kelsey if she would be joining us for the pitch dinner tomorrow. Derek quickly chimed in, stating she would absolutely be attending. He said she was going to sit right next to him at the table to help guide the conversation and ensure his personal brand remained the focal point of the evening. I nodded slowly, scraping the chopped garlic into a small ceramic bowl. I told them that sounded like a wonderful strategy. Kelsey smirked clearly, thrilled that she had established dominance in my own home with zero resistance. Derek grabbed 2 bottles of sparkling water from the fridge and led Kelsey into the living room to review his presentation slides with Barbara, following closely behind to offer them snacks. The moment they left the kitchen, I picked up my phone, stopped the recording, and saved the audio file directly to a secure cloud folder shared with Jamal. Derek was not just stealing money anymore. He was paying his ex-girlfriend with stolen federal funds to participate in his fraudulent scheme. The trap was getting more crowded by the minute. But I knew I had plenty of room for all of them. Friday morning arrived with a heavy downpour of rain, matching the suffocating atmosphere inside my house. I had been forced to burn a vacation day from my corporate job just so I could spend 8 hours playing a personal chef for the man who was currently robbing me blind. By noon, the rented staging furniture had been delivered. Barbara strutted around the living room, directing the delivery men to place the overpriced velvet chairs and glass tables exactly where my own furniture used to sit. The house looked like a sterile lobby of a boutique hotel. It looked absolutely nothing like us. I spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen preparing the 5-course menu. I carefully shucked 24 fresh oysters, prepared a rich saffron risotto, and meticulously trimmed the Wagyu beef rib-eyes. Derek did not offer to help once. Instead, he treated my kitchen like a restaurant line and treated me like a line cook who was one mistake away from being fired. He hovered over my shoulder, checking the temperature of the oven and aggressively critiquing the way I arranged the truffle shavings on the appetizer plates. He told me I was slicing the artisanal bread too thick. He complained that the wine glasses I set out were not polished well enough, claiming he could see water spots that would offend a billionaire. I simply nodded, keeping my head down, and grabbed a microfiber cloth to repolish the crystal. I did not argue. I let him exert his fake authority because every time my phone vibrated in my pocket, it was a silent update from Jamal. The offshore wire transfer of the stolen $100,000 was moving through the automated clearinghouse. The federal crime was inches away from being permanently locked in. At 5 o'clock, Derek walked back into the kitchen wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His hair was slicked back and he reeked of an expensive cologne that I knew he had bought with my credit card. He poured himself a glass of sparkling water and leaned against the granite island, watching me whisk the vinaigrette for the salad course. Upstairs, I could hear the heavy footsteps of Kelsey, who had arrived an hour earlier to do her hair and makeup in my master bathroom. "Listen to me very carefully," Derek commanded, his tone sharp and condescending. "Richard Harrison is arriving at exactly 7. When the doorbell rings, you do not answer it. Barbara will take his coat. I will introduce him to Kelsey, who is going to act as my co-founder tonight. We are going to sit at the dining table and you are going to serve the courses exactly 15 minutes apart." I stopped whisking and looked up at him. I wiped my hands on my apron and asked him if I should set a 4th plate for myself at the end of the table. Derek scoffed, shaking his head as if I had just asked the most ridiculous question in the world. "Absolutely not," he said, letting out a harsh laugh. "You are not sitting with us. This is a high-stakes investor meeting, Olivia. We need to project an image of a dynamic, forward-thinking tech power couple. Kelsey understands that dynamic. She knows the industry buzzwords. She knows how to laugh at the right times and charm high-net-worth individuals. You are a bookkeeper. You would just sit there looking exhausted and kill the entire vibe of the pitch." He pointed a finger at the swinging door that separated the kitchen from the formal dining room. "You will stay in the kitchen," he instructed, his voice dropping into a cold command. "When you bring the plates out, you pour the wine from the right. You clear the empty plates from the left and you do not speak unless spoken to. For tonight you are the help. Do you understand? The help." I looked at the man I had married. The man whose laundry I had folded for 5 years. The man whose children I had birthed. He was standing in the house I legally owned wearing clothes I paid for, preparing to pitch a fraudulent company funded by money he stole from our kids. And he was ordering me to act like a silent caterer while his ex-girlfriend played the role of his supportive partner. I did not slap him. I did not throw the bowl of vinaigrette at his perfectly styled hair. Instead, I felt a supreme, almost euphoric sense of calm wash over my entire body. I looked him dead in the eye and offered him a soft, completely obedient smile. I understand completely. Derek, I said, my voice smooth and unwavering. I will stay in the kitchen. I will serve the food. I will not make a single sound to ruin your big night. Good, Derek said, adjusting his expensive tie with a smug expression. Just do your job and we will all be rich by tomorrow. He walked out of the kitchen completely blind to the reality of his situation. He thought he had successfully relegated me to the shadows. He had no idea that I was not hiding in the kitchen. I was waiting in the control room and my finger was hovering right over the launch button. The kitchen doors swung shut, the soft thud sealing me inside my designated workspace. I stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter drifting in from the living room. Derek, Barbara, and Kelsey were celebrating their imaginary victory, clinking glasses, and practicing their pitch. They sounded so incredibly confident. They sounded like people who believed they had successfully manipulated the system and completely broken the woman paying for it all. I turned back to the granite island and picked up my chef knife, resuming my preparation of the Wagyu beef. My hands were perfectly steady. I glanced up at the digital clock on the stainless steel oven. It was exactly 5 in the evening. Richard Harrison was scheduled to arrive in exactly 2 hours. The house was filled with the rich savory aroma of roasting garlic and searing meat, masking the absolute toxicity of the people waiting in the next room. I focused on the rhythmic motion of chopping fresh herbs, using the repetitive physical task to keep my adrenaline from boiling over. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. But I knew I could not rush the process. Suddenly, a sharp double vibration buzzed against my hip. I set the knife down immediately. I wiped my hands clean on a fresh towel and reached deep into the pocket of my apron. I pulled out my phone and unlocked the screen. It was a message from Jamal sent through our encrypted messaging application. I tapped the notification, my heart giving a hard, heavy thump against my ribs. The message was an image attachment followed by a single line of text. I opened the image first. It was a high-resolution screenshot taken directly from Jamal's forensic financial tracing software. The screen was filled with complex routing numbers, international bank codes, and digital timestamps. But right in the center of the image, highlighted in bright red by Jamal's system, was the transaction I had been waiting for all week. Outgoing wire transfer completed. Principal amount $100. 000. Originating account Derek's personal checking destination. A shadow offshore cryptocurrency exchange registered in a jurisdiction that refused to comply with United States tax laws. I stared at the numbers on the screen, letting the reality of the image wash over me. The money was gone. Derek had actually done it. He had taken the fraudulent home equity loan secured by my forged signature on a property he did not own and wired the entire sum across international borders to buy unregulated digital junk. I scrolled down to read the text message Jamal had attached below the screenshot. The wire just cleared the automated clearinghouse. Jamal wrote, "The funds have officially left domestic jurisdiction." He used a digital network to execute the transfer. The trap is officially set. Olivia. The federal crime of felony wire fraud is now 100% complete. There is no reversing it. There is no undoing the transaction. He just bought himself a mandatory federal prison sentence. A long shaky breath escaped my lips. I leaned back against the cool marble of the countertop, closing my eyes for just a second. For the past 3 days, I had lived in a constant state of anxiety, terrified that Derek might suddenly get cold feet, or that the bank would flag the transaction before it cleared. If the money had stayed in his domestic checking account, his high-prick defense attorney might have been able to argue his way down to a lesser charge. But he had been too greedy. His absolute desperation to hide the stolen money had pushed him right over the cliff. My phone buzzed again with another message from Jamal. I am compiling the final data packet right now. Jamal typed. I am sending the forged loan documents, the fake notary registration, and this offshore wire confirmation directly to the Assistant District Attorney and the Regional Financial Crimes Task Force. They have been waiting on standby since yesterday. I will be at your house before the dessert course is served. Hold the line. Olivia. I typed back a single word. Understood. I slipped the phone back into my apron pocket. The power dynamic in the house had irrevocably shifted. Even if the three people laughing in the living room had no idea, Derek was no longer a husband demanding respect. He was a federal suspect, blissfully enjoying his final hours of freedom. Barbara was no longer a mother-in-law asserting dominance. She was a woman about to watch her golden child be destroyed by his own hubris. I turned my attention back to the stove. I adjusted the heat under the saffron risotto, stirring the creamy mixture with deliberate measured motions. The trap was armed. The evidence was secured. All I had to do now was plate the food, serve the wine, and wait for the doorbell to ring. At exactly 6:55 in the evening, the sharp melodic chime of the front doorbell echoed through the house. The sound cut right through the low, pretentious jazz music Derek had blasting from the smart speakers in the living room. I was standing in this kitchen carefully wiping the edges of the appetizer plates, ensuring not a single drop of sauce was out of place. The risotto was perfectly creamy. The wagyu was resting. And the trap was fully operational. Before I could even reach for a fresh kitchen towel, the swinging door burst open. Barbara rushed into the kitchen, her face flushed with frantic excitement. She was wearing a completely over-the-top sequined dress that looked entirely inappropriate for a business dinner in the suburbs. She pointed a sharp manicured finger at me. "The investor is here," Barbara hissed, her voice trembling with anticipation. "Stop messing with the food and get out to the foyer right now. You need to take their wet coats and umbrellas. And remember, keep your head down and do not speak unless he asks you a direct question." I placed the wiping cloth on the counter and smoothed down the front of my plain black apron. I offered her a short, obedient nod, completely masking the adrenaline surging through my veins. I followed her out of the kitchen and walked quietly down the hallway toward the front entrance. The heavy mahogany front door was already wide open. The cold, damp evening air rushed into the house, bringing with it the smell of heavy rain and wet asphalt. Derek was standing squarely in the doorway, practically vibrating with eager energy. He was holding a silver tray with 3 crystal fluts of expensive champagne. Right beside him stood Kelsey, striking a posed, unnatural stance, flashing a perfectly rehearsed influencer smile. Parked in our driveway, completely boxing in the fraudulently purchased Ford Raptor, was a massive black Lincoln Navigator town car. A driver in a dark suit was standing on the wet pavement holding a large black umbrella over the man stepping out of the back seat. Richard Harrison did not look like the easy target Derek thought he was. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s with sharp silver hair and a meticulously tailored navy pinstriped suit. He moved with the effortless authority of someone who managed billions of dollars. But what made the blood drain from Derek's face for a fraction of a second was the fact that Richard had not arrived alone. 2 younger men, both carrying heavy leather briefcases and wearing equally severe suits, stepped out of the town car right behind him. Derek cleared his throat quickly, recovering his fake bravado, and stepped forward to greet them. "Richard, welcome to our home," Derek boomed, holding out the tray of champagne. "We are absolutely thrilled to have you here tonight. I see you brought some associates with you." Richard stepped over the threshold, his dark eyes instantly scanning the sterile rented furniture in the living room. He did not reach for the champagne. "Good evening, Derek," Richard said, his voice deep and completely devoid of warmth. "Yes. I never attend a pitch meeting without my lead risk analyst and my general counsel. When we discuss multimillion-dollar evaluations, I prefer to have my legal team present to review the structural integrity of the founder's claims. I assume that will not be a problem. Derek swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously above his expensive silk tie. Oh, of course not. Derek stammered, his confident smile faltering for just a second. We operate with complete transparency here. Speaking of the team, I want to introduce you to Kelsey. She is my co-founder and the visionary behind our brand aesthetic. Kelsey stepped forward, completely ignoring the two intimidating lawyers, and reached out to shake Richard's hand. She practically shouted her introduction, launching into a rehearsed elevator pitch about synergy and holistic user engagement. Richard shook her hand politely, but his expression remained entirely unreadable. The two lawyers behind him simply stared at her with blank analytical precision. Barbara quickly snapped her fingers in my direction, breaking the awkward tension. Olivia, take their coats, Barbara commanded loudly, making sure the guests heard her. Exerting authority over the help, I stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway, keeping my head tilted down exactly as I had been instructed. I did not want Richard looking at my face just yet. I approached the men and held out my arms. Richard unbuttoned his heavy rain-soaked cashmere overcoat and handed it to me. He murmured a quiet thank you, barely glancing in my direction as he focused his attention back on Derek. The two lawyers handed me their damp coats and umbrellas as well. The weight of the wet wool in my arms was heavy, but I felt incredibly light. I turned away from the group and walked toward the hall closet. Derek was enthusiastically ushering Richard and the legal team into the dining room, promising them an unforgettable culinary experience and a revolutionary business proposal. Kelsey was trailing closely behind them, giggling loudly at a joke Richard had not even made. I hung the heavy coats on the wooden hangers, securing the umbrellas in the brass stand by the door. I smoothed down my apron one last time. Derek thought he was walking into a casual conversation with a wealthy man who would just hand over a check. He had no idea he had just invited a corporate legal team into a house paid for by stolen funds. I turned on my heel and walked back into the kitchen to plate the first course. The curtain was rising and the audience was seated. I arranged the chilled oysters on a bed of crushed ice, garnished them with microgreens, and hoisted the heavy silver tray onto my fingertips. I pushed the swinging kitchen door open just a few inches, slipping quietly into the dining room. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly tense, though Derek seemed entirely oblivious to it. Richard Harrison had taken the seat at the head of the long glass dining table. He sat perfectly straight, his hands resting flat on the surface, exuding the quiet, lethal authority of a man who held the financial fate of entire corporations in his palm. Flanking him on either side were his two lawyers. They had already opened their briefcases, producing thick legal pads and silver pens. They did not look like men who were here to enjoy a home-cooked meal. They looked like predators preparing to dissect their prey. At the opposite end of the table stood Derek. He had connected his tablet to the large smart monitor mounted on the wall. Kelsey was seated aggressively close to where Derek was standing, her posture unnaturally rigid as she tried to project what she probably thought was corporate elegance. Barbara was seated across from Kelsey, her hands clasped under her chin, her face radiating a sickeningly proud glow. I stepped up to the table and began to serve the appetizers. I started with Richard moving silently to his right side to place the small plate of oysters before him. He did not look up at me. His gaze was locked entirely on Derek. I moved to the lawyers, then to Barbara, and finally to Kelsey, who actually scoffed quietly when I poured her sparkling water. I ignored her entirely. Once the plates were set, I retreated to my designated spot by the swinging kitchen door, holding the empty silver tray against my apron, blending perfectly into the background. Derek cleared his throat, flashed a blindingly fake smile, and tapped his tablet. The smart monitor flickered to life, displaying a title slide with a generic neon blue logo. Gentlemen. Derek began pacing back and forth with the exaggerated hand gestures of a late-night infomercial host. Welcome to the future of decentralized peer-to-peer engagement. We are living in a fast-paced digital ecosystem, but current platforms lack holistic synergy. My app, which I call Connectify Web3, is not just a platform. It is a paradigm-shifting digital environment designed to disrupt the traditional social networking matrix. I almost choked on the air I was breathing. It was a word salad of the highest order. Connectify Web3. It sounded like a parody of a tech pitch. As a finance manager who reviewed actual corporate business models every single day, I could instantly tell that his entire presentation was heavily plagiarized from out-of-date startup blogs. He was stringing together expensive-sounding buzzwords without offering a single coherent financial structure. Richard did not touch his oysters. He simply stared at Derek, his expression carved from stone. Derek continued clicking to the next slide, which featured a confusing web of interconnected nodes and arrows that pointed nowhere. We are utilizing a blockchain-enabled infrastructure to monetize user emotional bandwidth, Derek said, his voice rising with unearned confidence. By leveraging artificial intelligence algorithms, we can predict user synergy and optimize localized networking. One of the lawyers stopped writing. He looked up, his pen hovering over the legal pad. How exactly do you plan to monetize emotional bandwidth? The lawyer asked, his voice completely flat. What is the actual revenue generation model here? Are you charging a subscription fee, or are you relying on advertising revenue driven by user data harvesting? Derek froze. A bead of sweat formed at his hairline. He clearly had not prepared for actual financial scrutiny. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then gestured wildly toward Kelsey. That is an excellent question regarding the granular financials. Derek deflected awkwardly. But I think my co-founder and brand consultant, Kelsey, can speak to the community valuation aspect. Kelsey sat up straighter, fluffing her hair. Well, she began, her voice dripping with vocal fry. It is really all about the vibe. You see, modern users do not want to be monetized. They want to be empowered. Our brand identity is so organic and authentic that the community will naturally want to invest their crypto into our digital ecosystem. It is basically a lifestyle movement disguised as an app. The second lawyer slowly lowered his pen. A heavy, agonizing silence fell over the dining room. Barbara, entirely incapable of reading the room, clapped her hands together. Is it not brilliant? She gushed to Richard. My son has always been a visionary. He sees things the rest of the world is too slow to understand. Richard Harrison slowly turned his head to look at Barbara, his eyes devoid of any amusement. He then turned his gaze back to Derek, who was now sweating profusely under the harsh lighting of the dining room chandelier. I stood quietly by the kitchen door, watching the absolute train wreck unfold. Derek had stolen $100. 000, ruined his children's college fund, and committed federal wire fraud, all to stand in front of a billionaire and pitch an app that did not actually exist. The sheer humiliation of the moment was intoxicating, and the best part was that the real show had not even started yet. Derek swallowed nervously and clicked to his next slide, determined to recover the momentum he had just lost to the lawyers. He started talking louder, aggressively, pointing at a line graph that went straight up into the right corner of the smart monitor. He claimed that within 6 months, his app would reach a critical mass of user adoption, rendering traditional social media completely obsolete. He was throwing out terms like algorithmic scaling and disruptive innovation, completely ignoring the fact that neither Richard nor his legal team were looking at the presentation anymore. Richard had placed his hands flat on the glass dining table. He leaned back slightly in his rented velvet chair and slowly turned his head. He was looking directly past Derek's sweating face. He was staring straight at the swinging kitchen door where I stood holding the empty silver serving tray. Derek noticed Richard looking away and mistakenly thought he was losing the investor's attention. Derek quickly stepped into Richard's line of sight, clapping his hands together to create a loud, disruptive noise. Derek promised that if Richard signed the term sheet tonight, they could lock in a founder's valuation before the wider market caught on to the trend. Richard did not blink. He simply raised his right hand, holding up a single index finger. The gesture was so quiet and yet so commanding that Derek instantly snapped his mouth shut. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The only sound was the heavy rain beating against the dining room windows. Richard pushed his chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He stood up slowly, taking his time to button the center button of his navy pinstriped suit jacket. Derek mirrored his movement, straightening his own posture, a look of desperate, greedy hope washing over his face. Derek actually reached his right hand out fully, believing that Richard had heard enough and was standing up to shake on a multi-million-dollar investment deal right there in the dining room. But Richard did not reach for Derek's hand. He did not even look at Derek. He walked straight past my husband, stepping neatly around the large display monitor and walked directly toward the kitchen door. Barbara held her breath, her eyes wide with absolute confusion. Kelsey nervously checked her reflection in the glass of her water goblet, entirely unsure of what was happening and why the attention was no longer on their side of the room. Derek stood frozen with his hand awkwardly extended in the empty air, watching the billionaire bypass him completely. I did not move. I kept my posture perfectly straight, holding the silver tray against my plain black apron. I watched Richard Harrison approach me. When he was just 2 feet away, the cold analytical hardness in his dark eyes completely vanished. It was replaced by a look of genuine, warm recognition. Richard extended his right hand toward me. His voice resonated loudly through the quiet dining room, carrying easily over the sound of the rain outside. "Olivia," Richard said, a bright, authentic smile breaking across his face. "I had absolutely no idea you lived here." I shifted the silver tray to my left arm and reached out firmly, shaking the hand of the billionaire angel investor. "It is good to see you again, Mr. Harrison," I replied, my voice steady and completely professional. Richard let out a hearty laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Please call me Richard," he insisted warmly. "I was just talking about you with my legal team in the car on the way over here. I have to tell you that quarterly financial merger report your team submitted to the executive board this morning was absolutely brilliant. Your structural analysis of the supply chain integration saved us at least $2 million in projected quarterly losses. It was a masterclass in corporate finance." The words hung in the air like a detonated bomb. A masterclass in corporate finance. The billionaire investor had just stood in my dining room and openly praised the high-level corporate brilliance of the woman wearing a serving apron. I glanced over Richard's shoulder. The look of absolute paralytic shock on Derek's face was something I will savor for the rest of my life. His jaw had practically unhinged. He looked from me to Richard, his brain entirely unable to process the data it was receiving. He had spent the last 3 days telling everyone I was just a small-minded bookkeeper. He had forced me to hide in the kitchen because my working-class vibe would ruin his pitch. Barbara was gripping the edge of the glass table so hard her knuckles were white. Her mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. But no sound came out. She had thrown away my family photos because she thought my aesthetic was not good enough for this man. And now this man was standing in her son's dining room treating me like an equal. "Thank you, Richard," I said, maintaining my composed smile. My regional finance team worked very hard to ensure the data was ironclad before the acquisition finalized. "Wait," Derek finally stammered out, his voice cracking horribly. His face was the color of wet chalk. "Richard, how do you know my wife?" Richard turned around slowly, The warm smile instantly dropped from his face as he looked at Derek. His expression returned to the cold, predatory glare he had worn when he first arrived. Richard looked at Derek as if he were looking at a cockroach that had somehow managed to dress itself in a tailored suit. The billionaire did not answer immediately. He took a slow, deliberate step away from the kitchen door and moved back toward the center of the dining room, ensuring every single person in the room was paying absolute attention to what he was about to say. "How do I know your wife?" Richard repeated, his voice laced with heavy biting sarcasm. "Derek, you invited me into this house under the pretense that you were a detail-oriented founder. You claim to be a visionary. Yet you somehow failed to do the most basic background research on the person you were desperately trying to pitch. I am the chief executive officer and majority shareholder of the international medical conglomerate that recently acquired the supply company where Olivia works. She is not just a low-level employee. She is the regional finance manager who oversees the entire Eastern Seaboard operations for my corporation." Derek took a physical step back, his hip violently bumping into the edge of the large presentation monitor. The screen wobbled, mirroring his own sudden instability. He looked frantically between Richard and me, his eyes wide with a manic kind of terror. Regional Finance Manager Derek choked out the word, sounding entirely foreign and impossible on his tongue. "No. That is incorrect. You must have her confused with someone else. She does basic corporate bookkeeping. She works in a small cubicle. She does data entry." Richard let out a sharp, humorless bark of laughter that echoed loudly against the rented staging furniture. "Bookkeeping. Data entry. Is that what you honestly think she does?" Richard shook his head, looking at Derek with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. "Derek, your wife authorized the movement of over $40 million in corporate assets just this morning. She sits in on executive board meetings that you could not even buy a ticket to attend. She manages a financial portfolio that dwarfs the gross domestic product of small island nations. The fact that you have been living in the same house as her, treating her like a hired caterer, and have absolutely no idea who she is or what she is capable of, is staggering." Barbara let out a strange high-pitched wheeze. She slumped back into her velvet chair, her hands trembling so violently that she had to grip the edge of the glass table to steady herself. The woman she had forced to carry luggage and order leather couches was a high-powered corporate executive. Kelsey had gone completely pale, her carefully constructed influencer bravado evaporating into thin air. She suddenly looked very small and incredibly ridiculous in her tight designer clothes, realizing she had just mocked a woman who held more power than everyone in the room combined. But Richard was not finished. He turned his attention to his two lawyers, who had been standing silently by the table, their legal pads ready, and their expressions completely stoic. "Do you actually think I drove all the way out to the suburbs on a rainy Friday night to listen to an unemployed man use words like holistic synergy?" Richard asked, his tone dropping into a dangerous growly register. "I fund viable technology. Derek. I do not fund buzzword generators. I receive hundreds of pitch decks every single week from actual innovators. Yours was so incredibly disorganized, so amateurish, and so financially illiterate that my automated screening software almost sent it directly to the spam folder. Then why are you here?" Derek practically whined, his entire reality crumbling around him. His voice cracked with genuine desperation. "If you hated the pitch so much, why did you agree to the dinner? Why did you bring your legal team?" Richard leaned forward, resting his heavy knuckles on the glass dining table. "Because before I throw a proposal in the trash, it goes to my regional finance teams for a final risk assessment. Your pitch deck landed on a desk in Olivia's department, and her team flagged it immediately, not as a bad investment, but as a potential scam." Derek opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. "When my analysts dug into your background, Richard continued, his voice cold and relentless. They found no evidence of a working prototype. They found no user base. They found absolutely no proprietary code. What they did find was a man with a history of tax evasion operating an unregistered crypto scheme. They flagged your proposal as a high-risk, fraudulent endeavor designed to separate gullible investors from their capital. I only accepted this dinner invitation because I wanted my legal team to personally evaluate whether your business practices violated any of our corporate fraud parameters before I reported you to the authorities. I had absolutely no idea until I walked into this house that the scammer I was investigating was married to my best finance manager. The dining room was so quiet I could hear the rain lashing aggressively against the window panes. Derek's grand illusion was entirely shattered. He was stripped bare, exposed not just as a failure, but as a con artist who had inadvertently pitched his scam to his own wife's boss. He had invited the executioner into his own home and offered him champagne. Richard straightened his suit jacket and looked over at me. He gave a small respectful nod, signaling that he had said his piece. He was handing the floor over to me. I placed the silver serving tray on the nearest side table. I did not need it anymore. I was done serving. I took a slow, deliberate step away from the kitchen door and walked toward the head of the dining table. The time for silence was over. I untied the knot of the plain black apron at my waist. I pulled the fabric over my head and let it fall carelessly onto the hardwood floor. It landed in a crumpled heap over my sensible navy work slacks. A physical shedding of the pathetic subservient role I had forced myself to play for the last 3 days. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and walked slowly toward the head of the long glass dining table. The terrified, obedient wife who cooked Wagyu beef in the shadows was completely gone. In her place was the corporate executive who managed multi-million-dollar divisions. And I channeled every ounce of that boardroom authority. Derek immediately panicked. He lunged forward, his face flushing a deep angry red as he tried to regain control of his rapidly imploding reality. "Olivia, get back in the kitchen right now," he hissed, his voice trembling with a chaotic mix of rage and pure terror. He turned to Richard, forcing a desperate, strained laugh. "Richard, I apologize. My wife is just stressed from her little accounting job. She does not know what she is talking about. She has absolutely nothing to do with this company or this presentation." I did not even look at him. I simply raised my right-hand palm facing outward and locked my eyes entirely on his. "Stop talking, Derek," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the heavy air of the dining room with the force of a physical blow. It was the exact tone I used to shut down incompetent regional directors who tried to lie on their quarterly expense reports. It was absolute, unwavering, and cold. Derek actually snapped his mouth shut. He took a physical step back, his shoulders slumping as he was completely paralyzed by the sudden violent shift in my demeanor. I turned my attention back to the billionaire investor and his 2 lawyers. "Richard, I appreciate your analysts catching the glaring irregularities in his proposal," I said, keeping my tone perfectly professional and measured. "But your risk assessment team only saw the tip of the iceberg. They correctly flagged his business model as a scam. I am standing here to clarify exactly how that scam was being funded." Barbara let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, practically jumping out of her rented velvet chair. "Do not you dare say another word, Olivia," Barbara shrieked, the heavy floral scent of her perfume suddenly smelling sour in the tense room. "You are going to ruin his entire future. You are just jealous because you will never have his entrepreneurial spirit." I slowly turned my head to look at my mother-in-law. I felt absolutely no pity for the woman who had thrown my father's photographs in the garbage and treated me like a maid. "Barbara, I suggest you sit down and remain completely silent," I warned her, my eyes narrowing into a lethal glare, "because you have been an active enabling participant in this circus, and what I am about to disclose involves severe criminal activity." The word criminal hit the room like a bucket of ice water. The two lawyers immediately picked up their silver pens, their sharp eyes darting between me and Derek. Kelsey pushed her chair back slightly, pressing her spine against the wall as if she could physically distance herself from the incoming explosion. I looked back at Richard, who was watching me with intense respectful interest. "The man standing before you did not bootstrap a tech startup," I announced, projecting my voice so every single syllable was crystal clear over the sound of the rain outside. "He has not written a single line of proprietary code. He does not have a beta testing user base. What he does have is a severe allergy to honest work and a massive ego that requires constant financial feeding." I pointed a finger directly at Derek's chest. 3 days ago, my husband hacked into the protected $529 college savings plan that I established for our twin children. He bypassed the security questions, locked me out of the administrative portal, and completely drained the $45,000 balance. I worked double shifts auditing local businesses on my weekends for 5 years to build that fund. He stole every single penny of his own children's educational future just to buy that luxury truck sitting in the driveway outside. The dining room was dead silent. Richard stared at Derek with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Stealing from your own infant children to finance a fake corporate image," Richard said, his voice dropping into a low, venomous register. "That is a new level of pathetic. Even for an amateur con artist." Derek was hyperventilating now. He tugged violently at the collar of his expensive tailored suit, desperately trying to construct a lie to save himself. "It was a temporary loan," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly between Richard and me. "I was going to put it back as soon as we secured the funding tonight. You have to understand, Richard. I needed to project extreme success to attract high-level capital. But the truck was just the beginning of his shopping spree." I continued, completely ignoring his pathetic, desperate excuses. I had the floor and I was not going to stop until his entire foundation was reduced to ash. I looked directly at Kelsey, who was staring at Derek with wide, horrified eyes. He also used those stolen funds to pay his ex-girlfriend a $5,000 retainer to play the role of a fake co-founder. Tonight, Kelsey let out a small, terrified squeak, covering her mouth with her perfectly manicured hand. Both lawyers immediately began writing furiously on their legal pads, documenting the exact admission of stolen funds being used to hire fraudulent corporate officers. Derek was completely trapped. He had invited the executioner to dinner, and I had just handed the billionaire the axe. But I knew the college fund theft was only the beginning. It was time to introduce the real evidence. I turned away from the table for just a moment and walked over to the mahogany console near the entryway. Hidden inside the top drawer was the thick red folder Jamal had given me at the coffee shop. I pulled it out, the heavy card stock feeling like a weapon in my hands, and walked right back to where Derek was standing. He was still gasping for air, desperately trying to formulate a defense for stealing from his own children. He did not even get the chance to speak. I slammed the red folder down directly onto the center of his empty presentation plate. The loud smack of the heavy paper against the fine china made everyone at the table flinch. I flipped the folder open, revealing the dense stack of banking documents bearing the logo of a major national bank. "If stealing from your children was your only crime, Derek, you might have just walked away with a divorce and a ruined reputation," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "But your greed was far too massive for that." I tapped my index finger against the top page of the home equity line of credit agreement. 3 weeks ago, my husband decided that $45,000 was not enough to fund his delusions. He went online and applied for a $100,000 second mortgage against this house. The house that he completely signed over to me 14 months ago via a legally binding quick claim deed. Richard leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the upside-down document from across the table. One of his lawyers stood up slightly, adjusting his glasses to get a better look at the paperwork. Since the property is solely in my name, the bank required my explicit signature and a verified public notary to approve the loan. I continued tracing the blue ink on the final page. So Derek forged my signature. He completely fabricated my consent. Then he had one of his unemployed friends buy a fake notary stamp online to certify the forged document, bypassing the bank's security protocols. Derek gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning completely white. He looked as though he was going to vomit. "Olivia, please," he whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched plea. "Stop talking. We can fix this. I can cancel it." "You cannot cancel anything, Derek," I snapped back, my eyes locking onto his terrified face. "The loan was approved yesterday. The bank deposited $100,000 into your personal checking account. And exactly 2 hours ago, while I was in the kitchen preparing your Wagyu beef, you wired every single penny of that stolen equity to an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange." The second lawyer dropped his pen. He looked at Derek with an expression of pure, unadulterated astonishment. "You wired fraudulently obtained funds across international borders?" the lawyer asked, his tone completely devoid of professional courtesy. "Are you completely insane?" Richard turned to his lead counsel. "Document all of this," Richard ordered his lawyers, his voice dangerously low. "We need a complete record showing we had absolutely no prior knowledge of this man's criminal activities before stepping foot on this property. I will not have my corporation tied to a federal financial investigation." I turned to the legal team, nodding in agreement. Exactly. He did not just commit a local crime. I looked back at Derek, reciting the charges Jamal had laid out for me, making sure every word hit him like a physical blow. "You committed aggravated identity theft. You committed federal bank fraud by defrauding a federally insured institution. And because you used a digital network to move those stolen funds across state lines to a shadow server, you officially committed felony wire fraud." The gravity of those federal statutes hung heavy in the dining room air. These were not minor infractions. These were Class C felonies that carried mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary. Derek was no longer a man trying to save his marriage or his fake company. He was a criminal cornered by his own digital paper trail. Barbara let out a loud, agonizing wail. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her son's impending prison sentence finally shattered her delusions of grandeur. She had spent her entire life protecting him from the consequences of his actions. But she could not protect him from the federal government. While Barbara sobbed and Derek hyperventilated, I noticed a sudden quiet movement out of the corner of my eye. Kelsey, the brand consultant, who had mocked my work clothes just 24 hours earlier, was slowly pushing her rented velvet chair away from the table. Her face was entirely drained of color. She had just realized that the $5,000 retainer Derek paid her came directly from a stolen federal wire transfer, making her an accessory to a major financial crime. Without saying a single word, Kelsey grabbed her oversized designer tote bag. She did not look at Derek. She did not look at Barbara. She kept her head down, tiptoed backward away from the dining table, and quietly slipped out the backsliding glass door into the pouring rain. The fake co-founder had abandoned ship, leaving her visionary CEO to drown entirely on his own. I looked down at Derek, who was staring blankly at the red folder on his plate. I had dismantled his entire life in less than 10 minutes. The heavy silence in the dining room was suddenly shattered by a deep mechanical roar. It was a loud, aggressive, revving sound accompanied by the distinct hiss of heavy air brakes releasing. The noise vibrated through the floorboards, cutting right through the sound of the pouring rain outside. Derek blinked, pulling his eyes away from the red folder on the table. He looked toward the large bay windows at the front of the living room. Flashing amber strobe lights were piercing through the darkness, reflecting violently against the rain-soaked glass and casting erratic yellow shadows across the rented velvet furniture. Richard and his two lawyers immediately turned their attention to the window. Even Barbara stopped her hysterical sobbing for a moment, wiping her mascara-stained cheeks as she peered through the glass. I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed over my chest, knowing exactly what was happening outside. Derek practically tripped over his own feet as he scrambled away from the dining table and ran into the living room. He pressed his face against the cold glass of the window, his breath fogging up the pane. Out in the driveway, illuminated by the harsh yellow lights, were two massive, heavy-duty tow trucks. They had bypassed the Lincoln Town car entirely by driving straight up onto the meticulously manicured front lawn, their massive tires tearing deep, muddy trenches into the grass. Three men wearing high-visibility raincoats were moving with incredible speed. They were dragging heavy steel chains and positioning hydraulic wheel lifts directly under the front and rear axles of Derek's prized $80,000 Ford Raptor. "What are they doing?" Derek screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He slapped his hands against the window. "That is my truck. They are scratching the paint." He frantically fumbled with the deadbolt on the front door, throwing it open and stepping out onto the covered porch. The cold wind whipped his expensive tie over his shoulder. "Hey," he yelled into the storm, waving his arms like a madman. "Get away from my vehicle. You cannot park on my grass." One of the men in the high-visibility raincoats did not even look up from securing the heavy chain around the front axle. He simply shouted back over the roar of the diesel engine, stating he had a legal repossession order and that if Derek stepped off the porch and interfered, he would call the police to have him arrested for obstructing a lawful recovery. Derek froze on the porch, the rain blowing in and soaking the front of his charcoal suit. He turned back toward the house, looking at me with wild, desperate eyes. "Olivia," he pleaded, his voice completely devoid of its former arrogance. "Call them off. Tell them there has been a mistake." The dealership promised I had a 30-day grace period for the first payment. I walked slowly out of the dining room and stood in the foyer, keeping a safe distance from the open door and the blowing rain. Richard and his legal team followed closely behind me, standing silently to observe the final collapse of the visionary tech founder. "There is no mistake, Derek," I said, projecting my voice so he could hear me over the idling tow trucks. "And this has absolutely nothing to do with a missed payment." Derek stared at me, water dripping from his slicked back hair into his eyes. "Then why are they taking it?" he demanded. "Because I made a few phone calls this afternoon while I was preparing your gourmet dinner," I explained calmly, relishing the absolute destruction of his ego. "First, I called the auto insurance company. I informed them that the initial premium was paid using funds stolen from a protected federal college account. The insurance provider immediately flagged the policy for fraud and cancelled your coverage on the spot. It is illegal to finance a vehicle without comprehensive insurance." Derek's mouth opened, but he had no words left. Then I called the finance department at the luxury dealership. I continued, my tone as sharp as a scalpel. "I introduced myself as your wife and the sole provider for our family. I forwarded them 5 years of your official tax returns, which show an income of exactly zero. I kindly informed the dealership that the proof of income documents you submitted to secure that $80,000 loan were entirely fabricated." One of Richard's lawyers actually let out a low whistle of appreciation. "You committed loan application fraud," I told Derek, watching the reality of his situation finally crush whatever fight he had left. The dealership realized they had handed an $80,000 asset to an unemployed man using stolen money and fake documents. They immediately revoked the financing agreement and issued an emergency repossession order to recover their property before you could hide it or destroy it. Outside, a loud metallic clank echoed through the driveway as the hydraulic lift engaged. The front end of the midnight black Ford Raptor was hoisted high into the air, its gleaming chrome rims spinning uselessly in the rain. Derek did not try to run out into the yard anymore. He simply collapsed against the doorframe, his wet clothes clinging to his shaking body. He watched in absolute silence as the tow truck driver climbed back into the cab, shifted the massive rig into gear, and pulled away from the house. The second tow truck followed closely behind their amber lights, flashing steadily as they dragged his ultimate status symbol down the dark suburban street, leaving nothing behind but deep, muddy ruts in the grass. The $80,000 executive vehicle was gone, and with it went the very last shred of Derek's manufactured dignity. Derek remained slumped against the doorframe, the cold rain blowing past him into the foyer. He did not move. He did not speak. The sound of the diesel engines faded down the street, taking his entirely fabricated identity with them. But while Derek was paralyzed by his sudden plunge into reality, his mother experienced a very different reaction. The shock that had kept Barbara quiet for the last 5 minutes suddenly morphed into a violent explosive rage. Barbara pushed herself up from the rented velvet dining chair. Her sequined dress caught the harsh light of the chandelier as she marched across the room, her high heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She stopped just a few feet away from me, her face contorted into a mask of pure irrational fury. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You vindictive, ungrateful little witch," Barbara screamed, her voice cracking with the sheer force of her anger. "How dare you? How dare you humiliate my son in front of important guests? You called the dealership. You ruined his business meeting. You actively destroyed his entire future because you are too small-minded to understand his potential." I stood my ground, not stepping back a single inch. I looked at the woman who had thrown my family photos into the garbage just 2 days prior. "He destroyed his own future," Barbara replied, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "I simply provided the documentation." Barbara let out a sound that was half gasp and half snarl. She slammed her hand down on the mahogany console table. "That is it," she declared, her chest heaving. "I am done watching you disrespect this family. I want you out. Go upstairs. Pack your cheap little work suits, and get out of my son's house right this second. I am kicking you out. You do not get to sabotage his life and then sleep under his roof. This house belongs to a visionary, and you are no longer welcome here." Richard Harrison, who was still standing quietly in the foyer with his legal team, actually let out a dry, incredulous chuckle. He shook his head, clearly astounded by the sheer depth of the generational delusion in front of him. I did not laugh. I simply turned around and walked back to the glass dining table. Derek had left the red folder sitting right where I had dropped it. I flipped past the forged loan documents and the wire transfer receipts until I found the crisp official paper bearing the blue county seal. I pulled it out and turned back to face my mother-in-law. "Barbara," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that immediately forced her to stop yelling. "Let me read something to you. I think you will find it incredibly relevant to your current threat." I held the document up so the harsh dining room light illuminated the text. I began to read the legal phrasing aloud, enunciating every single word so it echoed clearly through the room. "This quit-claim deed executed on the 14th of October by Derek hereby known as the Goethe releases and forever quit claims to Olivia hereby known as the grantee. All rights, title, interest and claim to the real property located at this address." I looked up from the paper, locking eyes with Barbara. "Do you know what that means, Barbara?" "It means that 14 months ago, when your brilliant visionary of a son was terrified of going to federal prison for tax evasion, He begged me to take complete ownership of this property to hide his assets from the Internal Revenue Service. Barbara's mouth dropped open. The angry flush in her cheeks instantly drained away, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. She looked toward the front door where Derek was still standing in the rain. But he refused to meet her eyes. He knew exactly what he had signed. He gave it all to me. I continued taking a slow step toward her. I am the sole legal owner of the ground you are standing on. Derek is not the lord of the manor. He is a tenant who just committed federal wire fraud against his landlord. Which means you are not standing in your son's house. You are standing in my house. Barbara stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the rented rug. She bumped into the wall, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. And since this is my property, I laid out my final terms. Maintaining my icy composure, I am exercising my right to remove unwanted trespassers. You brought 3 massive suitcases into my home because you plan to stay here permanently and treat me like a maid. You have exactly 10 minutes to drag that luggage out to your car. If you are still standing in my foyer at the end of those 10 minutes, I will call the police and have you physically removed for criminal trespassing. Barbara let out a pathetic high-pitched whimper. She looked at Richard as if the billionaire investor might somehow step in and save her from this humiliation. But Richard simply checked his expensive wristwatch and raised an eyebrow at her. You heard the woman? Richard stated coldly. The clock is ticking. Barbara let out a loud, defeated sob and frantically scrambled toward the guest room to pack her bags. The ultimate weapon she thought she possessed had just blown up in her face. I stood in my dining room, the quitclaim deed held firmly in my hand, completely and utterly in control of my own home. The sound of heavy, frantic footsteps echoed down the hallway as Barbara began tearing her belongings apart in the guest room. Derek was still standing in the foyer, the cold rain dripping from his ruined tailored suit forming a dark puddle on the hardwood floor. He watched his mother abandon him. And then he slowly turned his head to look at me. The sheer panic in his eyes began to curdle into something much darker and far more desperate. He reached out, grabbed the brass handle of the heavy mahogany front door, and shoved it shut, sealing us inside. He marched toward the dining room. He did not look like a visionary tech founder anymore. He looked like a cornered, dangerous animal. He stopped just inches away from me, using his height to loom over me, trying to cast a shadow of physical intimidation. The smell of wet wool and cheap cologne radiated off him, mixing with the metallic scent of his own fear. You are going to fix this. Derek hissed his chest, heaving with erratic breaths. You are going to sign that deed back over to me right now. I want my name back on this house. Olivia. If I have collateral, I can get a legitimate loan to pay off the bank and the dealership. You are my wife. And you are going to save me from this mess. I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch or look away. I simply looked up at his red, contorted face with absolute disgust. I am not signing anything. Derek. I stated, my voice smooth and unbothered. And you cannot use this house to pay off the bank because you already stole $100,000 of its equity. There is absolutely nothing left for you to take from me. Derek raised his hand, pointing a shaking finger right between my eyes. He stepped even closer, completely invading my personal space. You listen to me, he growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous violent whisper. I am not going down for this. You are going to call the authorities and tell them you authorized that home equity loan. You are going to tell them you forgot you signed it. You are going to take the fall for the notary, or I swear to God I will make your life a living hell. Before I could tell him that his threats meant absolutely nothing to me, Richard Harrison intervened. The billionaire investor did not just stand by and watch. He took a heavy commanding step forward, his own presence instantly dwarfing Derek's pathetic display of aggression. One of the lawyers immediately reached inside his suit jacket, pulling out his cell phone to dial emergency services. Step away from her right this second. Richard ordered, his voice echoing through the room like thunder. If you lay a single finger on my finance manager, I will ensure my legal team bankrupts you into oblivion before you even see the inside of a courtroom. Derek turned his head to snap at Richard, his fists clenching at his sides. But before he could utter a single word of defiance, 3 loud, heavy knocks hammered against the front door. It was not the polite knock of a dinner guest or a neighbor. It was the sharp, authoritative strike of law enforcement. The brass handle clicked and the front door was pushed open from the outside, throwing the cold wind and rain back into the foyer. Stepping over the threshold, looking absolutely immaculate in a tailored charcoal top coat, was Jamal. My brother-in-law took one look at Derek's aggressive posture, the clenched fists, and the red face, and let out a cold, humorless scoff. I highly suggest you back away from my sister-in-law, Derek, Jamal said smoothly, shaking the rainwater from his umbrella. Unless you want to add aggravated assault to your rapidly growing list of federal charges. Derek spun around his face, completely draining of whatever color it had left. Walking into the house, right behind Jamal were 2 broad-shouldered uniformed police officers. Their expressions were stern, and their hands rested cautiously on their heavy-duty belts. Flanking them was a tall man wearing a plain dark tactical jacket with a silver badge hanging prominently from a chain around his neck. The detective held a thick manila envelope in his right hand. The air in the living room seemed to evaporate entirely. The aggressive, intimidating husband, who had just threatened me, was instantly replaced by a trembling, terrified fraud. Jamal walked calmly into the living room, nodding respectfully to Richard and the legal team before turning his dark, calculating eyes onto Derek. I told you I would have the data packet ready before the dessert course, Jamal said, offering me a brief, proud smile. The Regional Financial Crimes Task Force works incredibly fast when you hand them an airtight forensic trail. The detective stepped forward, his boots leaving wet tracks on the hardwood floor. He bypassed the rented velvet furniture and stopped directly in front of Derek. He opened the manila envelope and pulled out a stack of official court-stamped documents. Derek, the detective, said, his voice flat and strictly professional. We have a warrant for your arrest. The detective stepped fully into the foyer, his wet boots squeaking slightly against the hardwood floor. He held the thick manila envelope up, his expression completely devoid of any sympathy. Derek took a trembling step backward, his back hitting the wall as the reality of the situation finally breached his thick walls of delusion. I am Detective Miller with the Regional Financial Crimes Task Force. The detective announced, his voice carrying a heavy authoritative weight. We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, and felony wire fraud. The district attorney reviewed the forensic data packet submitted by Jamal earlier today. We tracked the $100,000 fraudulent loan you took out against this property, and we monitored the automated clearinghouse when you wired those stolen funds to an unregulated offshore server exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes ago. Jamal stood comfortably by the front door, watching the scene unfold with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had successfully cornered his prey. He looked at Derek and shook his head. You left a digital trail a mile wide, Derek, Jamal said smoothly. You used a fake notary registration that expired 3 years ago, and you wired the funds from the exact same network you used to check your daily social media accounts. Forensic accounting is only difficult when the criminal is actually smart. Derek shook his head frantically, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. No, he pleaded, his voice cracking into a high pitch. You do not understand. I am an entrepreneur. I was securing venture capital. The money was just a temporary bridge loan for my startup. I am hosting a pitch dinner right now with a billionaire investor. Look at him. He is right there. The detective did not even blink at the pathetic excuse. He gestured toward the two uniformed police officers standing beside him. "Secure him," the detective ordered. The two officers stepped forward in unison. Derek tried to press himself further into the wall. But there was nowhere left to go. One officer grabbed his left arm, spinning him around firmly but professionally. The other officer grabbed his right arm, pulling it behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Derek's wrists echoed loudly in the foyer. It was the absolute finality of the sound that made Derek's knees buckle. The officers had to hold him up by his elbows to keep him from collapsing onto the floor. The expensive tailored charcoal suit he had purchased with stolen money was now wrinkled and soaked with rain, providing a pathetic contrast to the heavy steel chains binding his hands together. I stood silently near the dining room entrance, watching the man who had ordered me to serve his friends and act like a maid, now being treated like the criminal he truly was. Richard Harrison stood just a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. His two lawyers were actually taking notes on their legal pads documenting the arrest to ensure their firm was entirely insulated from Derek's radioactive fallout. Derek turned his head, his cheek pressing uncomfortably against the wall as the officers patted his pockets to search for contraband. He looked at Richard, his eyes wide with a manic, delusional hope. "Richard," Derek begged, his voice trembling violently. "Please. You are a powerful man. You have corporate lawyers. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them we are doing business together. I can still give you equity in the app." Richard looked down at Derek with an expression of profound disgust. "We are not doing business together, Derek," Richard stated, his voice as cold as ice. "You pitched a fraudulent concept to steal my money. Just like you stole your child's college fund and your wife's home equity. You are a parasite. If you ever contact my company or my finance manager again, I will personally ensure my legal team makes the rest of your life an absolute misery." Derek's delusional hope shattered completely. He finally realized that his tech founder persona was dead. He was not a visionary. He was a felon in handcuffs. He slowly turned his head away from the billionaire and looked at me. The arrogant husband who had micromanaged my cooking, mocked my corporate job, and invited his ex-girlfriend into my kitchen was completely gone. In his place was a pathetic, terrified boy begging for his mother. But his mother was currently in the guest room frantically packing her bags to avoid being arrested for trespassing. "Olivia," Derek sobbed, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and mixing with the rainwater on his face. "Please. You are my wife. You promised to stand by me. Call a defense attorney. Get the house appraised and post my bail. You cannot let them take me to federal holding. I will not survive in there. I am so sorry. Just pay the bail. Please." I looked at him. I remembered the 5 years of double shifts I had worked to save $45,000 for our children. I remembered the feeling of sheer panic when I saw the zero balance on my banking app. I remembered him handing me a grocery list for Wagyu beef and imported truffles while knowing he had left me with exactly $200 to my name. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity. No sadness. Just the clean, refreshing clarity of total victory. I took a slow step forward, stopping just out of his reach. I looked him dead in the eye, watching the sheer terror radiating from his face. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of emotion, and delivered the exact reality he had created for himself. "I would, dear," I said softly. "But you drained my savings. Good luck with the public defender." The detective gave a short nod, signaling the two officers to move. They guided Derek forward by his arms, leading him out of the foyer and into the harsh driving rain. Derek did not fight them. He did not look back at me again. His shoulders were slumped. His head hung low, the rain instantly plastering his hair to his forehead. I watched as they walked him down the same driveway where his $80 000 truck had been repossessed just moments before. A police cruiser was parked on the street, its red and blue lights slicing through the dark, stormy night. The officer pressed a hand to the top of Derek's head, guiding him into the back seat, and slammed the heavy door shut. The stark finality of that metal click echoed all the way up to the porch. Just as the police cruiser began to pull away, the sound of heavy plastic wheels clattering against the hardwood floor broke the silence inside the house. Barbara emerged from the hallway, struggling to drag her 3 massive suitcases behind her. She was panting, her sequined dress looking entirely absurd given the circumstances. She pushed her way to the front door, her eyes frantically scanning the empty driveway. When she saw the taillights of the police car disappearing down the street, she let out a gut-wrenching shriek. She dropped the handles of her luggage, leaving the bags stranded in the entryway, and practically threw herself onto the covered porch. "Derek," she screamed into the rain, her voice zero and desperate. "Bring him back. You cannot take my son." She stood there for a moment, getting soaked by the wind-blown rain before slowly turning around to face me. The sheer arrogance that had defined her entire existence was completely washed away. She was shivering, mascara running down her face in thick black streaks. She looked past me into the warm, brightly lit living room with its rented staging furniture, and then down at her 3 suitcases sitting by the door. She wrapped her arms around herself, stepping cautiously back toward the threshold. "Olivia, please." Barbara whimpered, her teeth actually chattering. "It is pouring out here. I cannot drive in this weather. My vision is terrible at night, and I am far too upset to operate a vehicle safely. Just let me stay in the guest room for tonight. We can figure all of this out in the morning. I promise I will not say a word. Just let me come inside." I stood in the doorway blocking her path. I looked at the woman who had intentionally poured scalding hot coffee on my work laptop to sabotage my career. I looked at the woman who had demanded I liquidate my retirement account to buy a leather sofa, and who had thrown my deceased father's photographs into the trash without a second thought. "Your 10 minutes are up, Barbara," I said, my voice as cold and unforgiving as the storm behind her. "You said you wanted to supervise the house to ensure no one ruined your son's big break. Well, the break is over. And as you so clearly pointed out earlier, I am too small-minded to understand your high society standards. I would hate to force you to sleep under the roof of a simple bookkeeper." I reached down, grabbed the handles of her 3 heavy suitcases, and shoved them forcefully out onto the porch. They crashed against the wet concrete, one of them tipping over and spilling into a puddle. Barbara let out a loud gasp, reaching out toward the doorframe. "Olivia, you cannot do this to family. You stopped being my family the moment you helped him steal from my children." I replied, "Get off my property." I stepped back into the foyer and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the mahogany door. I did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic excuse. I pulled the door shut, the heavy wood silencing her cries instantly. I reached up and turned the heavy brass deadbolt, the loud solid click securing my fortress. Then I reached over to the wall switch and flicked off the exterior porch light, plunging her into complete and utter darkness. The house was suddenly incredibly quiet. The suffocating tension that had plagued my home for the past 3 days was entirely gone. I let out a long, deep exhale, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. I turned around to face the foyer. Jamal, Richard, and the 2 corporate lawyers were still standing there watching me with expressions of profound respect. I offered them a genuine relaxed smile for the first time all evening. "Well," I said, clapping my hands together lightly, "I spent 4 hours preparing Wagyu beef ribeyes, saffron risotto, and fresh oysters. It is completely paid for, and it would be an absolute tragedy to let a gourmet meal go to waste." Jamal grinned, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. "I am starving," he admitted, And I believe we have a lot to celebrate." Richard Harrison nodded, a warm spark returning to his eyes. "Lead the way, Olivia. I cannot think of a better way to spend a Friday evening than dining with my top regional finance manager." We walked back into the dining room. I cleared away the red folder and the forged loan documents. Tossing them onto the kitchen counter, I took my rightful seat at the head of the long glass table. Richard sat to my right, Jamal to my left, and the legal team filled in the rest. We poured the expensive red wine, raised our glasses, and toasted to the end of a very long, very successful week. The food tasted absolutely incredible, seasoned with the sweet, unmistakable flavor of total justice. It has been exactly 12 months since the heavy brass deadbolt clicked shut on my front door, locking the toxicity out of my life for good. The rented velvet staging furniture was hauled away the very next morning, and I spent the weekend restoring my home. I unpacked the woven baskets Barbara despised and placed the framed photographs of my late father prominently on the mantel. The house finally breathed again. And so did I. Today, my life looks entirely different. I am no longer the exhausted woman running on 3 hours of sleep and cheap caffeine. I am sitting at the head of a massive mahogany conference table located on the top floor of our corporate headquarters. Richard Harrison kept his word. After reviewing my flawless execution of the regional supply chain merger, he officially promoted me to Vice President of Finance. I no longer need to audit small local businesses on my weekends to make ends meet. I manage a national division, and I set my own hours, and I come home every evening to a sanctuary that belongs entirely to me and my children. The financial disaster Derek tried to leave behind took several months of aggressive litigation to untangle. But with Jamal's relentless expertise, we secured an absolute victory. The federal government moved swiftly. They did not just arrest my ex-husband. They actively seized his hidden offshore cryptocurrency accounts before the unregulated servers could launder the funds. Through a strict court-ordered restitution mandate, the bank was fully reimbursed for the fraudulent home equity loan, and the terrifying lien on my property was permanently erased. Even more satisfying was the recovery of the twins' college fund. The $45,000 Derek stole from Leo and Mia was retrieved and deposited directly back into their protected 529 savings plan, along with an additional mandatory penalty fee that Derek was forced to forfeit. My children's future is completely secure, safely shielded from their father's monumental ego. As for Derek, there was no grand app launch. There was no billionaire angel investor waiting to post his bail. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence, Jamal and the district attorney had compiled his Hypric defense attorney quickly abandoned ship. The public defender assigned to his case strongly advised him to take a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial he was guaranteed to lose. Derek is currently serving a mandatory 5-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. He spends his days working in the prison laundry facility, earning pennies an hour, finally forced to understand the value of actual physical labor. Barbara, completely unable to maintain her delusion of high society grandeur without her golden child to project it onto, was forced to face her own financial reality. She downsized into a cramped, outdated one-bedroom apartment on the other side of the state. She sends me angry, misspelled letters every few months demanding I put money into Derek's commissary account so he can buy premium snacks. I simply drop them into the paper shredder unopened. Kelsey, the fake co-founder, scrubbed her entire social media presence after being formally interrogated by federal agents and vanished into complete obscurity. Looking back on the years I spent working myself to the bone while Derek played the misunderstood genius, I realized my biggest mistake was not the money I lost. It was the space I allowed him to take up in my mind. I had convinced myself that being a supportive partner meant carrying his dead weight. I believed that if I just worked a little harder, made fewer demands, and stayed quietly in the background, he would eventually step up and be the man our family needed. But some people simply do not want to grow. They just want a comfortable place to remain small, and they will happily drain your life force to fund their comfort. True independence is not just about having your own bank account or holding the sole title to a property deed. It is about recognizing your own intrinsic value and absolutely refusing to let anyone diminish it. It means never shrinking yourself, hiding your ambitions, or downplaying your success just to make a lazy, insecure man feel tall. I spent 5 years playing the submissive bookkeeper so Derek could pretend to be a visionary. The moment I stopped playing the part, his entire manufactured world collapsed and my real life finally began. If you are watching this and you find yourself constantly exhausted, financially drained, and emotionally empty because you are carrying a partner who refuses to walk on their own, I need you to hear this loud and clear. You do not owe anyone your future. You do not owe anyone your peace. Start quietly organizing your exit strategy today. Protect your assets. Gather your evidence. Lean on the people who actually support you. And stop setting yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm. Thank you for listening to my story. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories of women taking their absolute power back. Let me know in the comments below if you have ever had to cut dead weight out of your life to finally reach your full potential. Remember, you hold the pen to your own life story. Make sure you write an ending that you truly deserve. Olivia's journey perfectly illustrates a painful but vital truth we often mistake self-sacrifice for support. For years, she played the role of an exhausted, submissive partner to protect Derek's fragile ego. She intentionally dimmed her own brilliant corporate success so his fabricated tech founder persona could take center stage. The primary lesson here is undeniable. Shrinking yourself to make an insecure partner feel tall does not save the relationship. It only breeds deep resentment and actively enables their most toxic destructive behaviors. The reality of financial abuse. The narrative highlights exactly how financial manipulation thrives in the shadows of assumed submission. Derek weaponized Olivia's hard work, draining her children's college fund and forging her signature on federal bank documents because he firmly believed she would absorb the damage just as she always had. However, Olivia's ultimate victory was secured not by throwing an emotional tantrum, but by quietly mastering the facts. She understood her legal rights, secured her financial assets, and leveraged the undeniable power of a documented paper trail. She relied on forensic accounting and federal law, grounding her revenge entirely in reality. Reclaiming your true authority. Empowerment requires radical honesty about who you are and what you tolerate in your own home. Olivia only reclaimed her life when she stopped playing the part Derek assigned to her and stepped fully into her actual authority. Her story is a stark reminder that your potential should never be held hostage by someone else's refusal to grow. You cannot fix a partner who views your success as a threat and your bank account as their personal funding source. Take a hard look at your own relationships today and actively ensure you are never sacrificing your financial security or self-worth to keep someone else comfortable.